Dr. Brulhart is graduated from the University of Fribourg, like me, but a few years later.
5 years.
He's lawyer. He was head of the Liechtenstein Financial Intelligence Unit from 2004 to 2012. Director of the Financial Information Authority of the Vatican in 2012, named by Pope Benedict, and president of the Financial Information Authority of the Vatican, named by Pope Francis since 2014. Dr. Brulhart.
Eminenza, Excellencies, Monsignori, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be here today, and I was very happy to receive this kind of invitation. Normally, I'm only allowed to speak outside of the Vatican, and hardly ever somebody's listening to me inside of the Vatican. So I'm very pleased to have this audience here. So you see the topic, and it's a little bit hard after this wonderful meditation we just had a few minutes ago, to go back to the hard facts of life and being confronted with reality. But I will try to do that in the next 45 minutes, and I promise you I will also give you some time for questions. I know I already heard it before that some people are very much interested to finally get to hear what is not written in the media. I'm not sure if I can fulfill all your wishes, but I do my very best to reply in the most transparent and, what is even more important, honest way. Now, if you go to the facts, and that's actually what I'm planning to speak about, this brings me back to the past, and sometimes it's not too bad to look a little bit back. And precisely, let's go back to the years 2007, 2008, about 10 years ago. We were at that time, we were in the midst of the financial crisis. It's already 10 years ago, indeed. That time, the global financial system was close to collapse, and measures had to be taken, and they were taken. Now, if you look in there, who was on the top of that, it was very much the G20 who have taken the lead, and in a nutshell, what they were doing to rebuild, to re-establish the integrity of the global financial system was actually built on 3 pillars. One pillar in fighting money laundering and terrorism financing, so they gave the mandate on that to the so-called Financial Action Task Force. We'll hear a little bit more about that later on. Second pillar was on the supervisory and regulatory side. The mandate by the G20 was given, at that time it was called the Financial Stability Forum. In the meanwhile, it has been kind of slightly changed to the Financial Stability Board. And the third pillar was mainly on taxes, on tax transparency, and the mandate was given to the OECD, and then the OECD kind of established the Global Forum on Transparencies. So these were kind of the answers to the financial crisis by the global leaders, particularly by the G20 in the period of 2007, 2008, and the summits in London, Washington, and Pittsburgh. So that was kind of the starting point. Now, why I'm telling you all that? What is the link to the Vatican? Actually, there's a very direct link, because the consequence of all these initiatives of these 3 bodies were the same. All the 3 bodies, so the FATF, the FSB, and the Global Forum on Transparency, had the order to identify so-called high-risk jurisdictions for the global financial system. Now, you might argue, the Vatican, financial center, do we have a stock exchange here, Wall Street? Do we have insurance companies? Do we have commercial banks here? No. The financial sector here in the Vatican is a very, very minor one and has to a very limited extent something to do with commercial activities. However, the rules of the game that time and also today were applicable for all of us, also for the Vatican. And that has led to some very unfortunate outcomes. I hope I didn't say anything wrong. So the very direct consequence, or one of the criterias in kind of defining or kind of finding out what kind of jurisdictions could be considered as a high-risk jurisdiction for the global financial system was done in a different way, and I'm not going to kind of bother you with technical issues or with too many technicalities. But one of the most important kind of criteria was that any jurisdiction that has never undergone any so-called kind of country assessment, that means, and we are here now in the field of fighting money laundering and terrorism, so kind of under the umbrella of the Financial Action Task Force, so any jurisdiction that never has been kind of assessed by the FATF or any other similar body worldwide was considered as a so-called high-risk jurisdiction. And actually, that is what happened to the Vatican, because in 2007, 2008, 2009, the Vatican neither had a so-called anti-money laundering law, nor had a structure in place with relevant authorities in tackle these kind of issues. Now, you can argue if it was necessary that time, you can argue if it's necessary today, but I think history has proven us that it was the right thing to take action. So that was one element which allowed then other jurisdictions, so they were not obliged to do so, but it allowed other jurisdictions to kind of define and almost kind of black stamp the Vatican as a high-risk jurisdiction, with the consequences that then if the Vatican or Vatican institutions, like the Institute for Religious Works, to a certain extent also APSA, so the Administration for the Patrimony of the Holy See, when they wanted to kind of carry out financial activities outside of the Vatican on an international level, that they could face, let's say, a certain scrutinies, that they could face certain problems, because then the financial institution outside of the Vatican would start to apply what we would call enhanced due diligence requirements, so also cost intensive, more information to be provided, etc. And if you look back 6, 7, 8 years, so accounts got frozen, and all of a sudden by the end of 2012, for example, credit cards in the Vatican didn't work anymore. So that was more or less kind of the environment we were in. Now, if rightly or wrongly, whoever has applied these kind of measures, it's a matter of fact, and I told you I'm interested in talking about facts, and that's what we have to deal with. So that was more or less kind of the starting point that time. An additional element, especially, and that's quite important, so to finalize, let's say, kind of the environment we were in 2009, by the end of 2009, the Vatican signed a so-called monetary convention with the European Union to be allowed to have the euro as official tender, as official currency here in the Vatican. You can argue positive, everybody has his own view on that, but as a consequence of that, the Vatican committed to implement all anti-money laundering directives, regulations of the European Union. No? That often is getting forgotten. So, in other words, the Vatican is obliged, and today also does, is obliged to apply all relevant directives of the European Union to fight anti-money laundering, to fight money laundering, not anti-money laundering, to fight money laundering, to fight money laundering and financing of terrorism. Every single directive, currently the 4th directive, the 5th is already in the pipeline to do that. And that was kind of the birth of actually the authority I'm chairing today, and also of the first anti-money laundering law, which has been established by Pope Benedict by the very end of 2010. So that's kind of the environment. Now, as I just said, we had then certain developments in after 2009, 2010, 2012 with the credit cards, which was leading to additional reforms. And so what have we done? And that's actually kind of what I was invited today to talk about. So what have we done so far? I had the honor to come here in end of or third quarter of 2012, and it was really, at least for me personally, to come then also up with advice and how we can do that. It was really first about understanding what really happened in the past. No? Why do we find the Vatican, the Holy See, in such a situation? How could that happen? And so, you know, there was a certain pressure and everybody wanted to see kind of quick results, quick wins going out. But it was really about getting an understanding, what are the factors that were driving this kind of situation? Who are the people? No, they have a certain interest, they're involved. Who are the players, the actors, especially also internally? Because there was a clear vision in building, in establishing a tailor-made system. It's easy to do kind of a copy-paste exercise, and you take whatever the Italian law or the Swiss law or the American law and just make kind of copy-paste and build it in. But the Vatican is unique. The Vatican is different in a good way. No? But especially when we look into its finances, it's not a commercial financial center, but there's a need for financial activities. And the question here is, what are the risks and vulnerabilities of that in having the Holy See as a global institution to be active in also in areas in the world where there's war, dealing with jurisdictions that there are sanctions, where you have missions, where you have priests, where you have nuns, that they're doing a wonderful world, but they also have to have a certain financial support to carry out its activities. And you cannot do that via commercial bank or whatever. So you have to address the issues how they are. And so it was really about building a tailor-made system to protect the Vatican, and it's building a system for the Vatican, not for anybody else outside in the world. It's really for the Vatican as such. So what have we done in concrete in the last 4 or 5 years? So we started to look into the legal framework, and we came up with a completely new legal framework with the so-called Law Number 18 in 2013, focusing in a very tailor-made way in fighting financial crimes, but also, in addition, putting in a regulatory component, because there are always 2 levels. So on the material side, so you can fight money laundering, illicit behavior and all that. But on the other side, you also want to ensure that the structures, so on the supervisory and regulatory side, that you have proper structures in place, that you have a relevant governance, that you have functioning internal procedures, that they allow you to do the work on the material side. So a new legal framework, Law Number 18, and then 1.5 years later, so-called Regulation Number 1, really covering the supervisory and regulatory side as such. But to execute the law and to implement it, you also have to have the relevant structures. And this led us to having a new statute or an amended statute of my authority by the end of 2013, which allowed us under one umbrella, under the Autorità Informazione Finanziaria, to have kind of 2 bodies. One, the so-called Financial Intelligence Unit, and I will come to that in a second. And the second one being the supervisor and regulator of any institution in the Vatican that is carrying out on a professional basis financial activities. It's a little bit an odd definition, but it's quite helpful, especially for internal and international purposes. So that's currently actually, so the supervised entity today is exclusively the Institute for Religious Work, the IOR. Now, when I'm talking about the Financial Intelligence Unit, what does that mean? So what are we doing in concrete there? So in every jurisdiction, or almost every jurisdiction in the world, but especially in every jurisdiction in the Western world, each financial institution is obliged to report to an authority, so which is normally the so-called Financial Intelligence Authority, any suspicion on transactions or client behavior or whatever it has when it's carrying out its current KYC, so know your customer, the due diligence, the due diligence measures, or transaction monitoring, etc. So the financial institutions, especially since 9/11, have become kind of a longer arm of law enforcement, but you want to filter that. So you want to understand what your clients are doing, if they're carrying out in a proper way their activities, and again, if there is unusual behavior as a financial institution, you're obliged to dig deeper to get an understanding if these kind of transactions are plausible or not, and if they're not plausible, they become suspicious, and you have to report that to the Financial Intelligence Unit, which here in the Vatican is AIF. What is the Financial Intelligence Unit doing then with that? Very simple. We are analyzing it. How to do it? Not that simple. What you normally need is international cooperation. So especially in an environment like here in the Vatican, beautiful state, but not too big. So as you can imagine, global institution, many international interactions. So you need partners you can work together. And that was one of the steps really to enter into international cooperation with Italy, with the US, with Switzerland, with Luxembourg, everywhere there where the Vatican, with Singapore, with Australia, everywhere there where the Vatican, in a way or another, directly, indirectly, has any kind of financial interactions to bring forward its opere. No? That allowed us, and allows us today, to filter the reports we receive from the financial institutions here in the Vatican, and if we kind of put enough meat on the bone, then we will forward the so-called suspicious activity or suspicious transaction reports to the promoter of justice here within the Vatican. The Vatican, as a sovereign jurisdiction, all the different bodies here, from the FIU to the promoter of justice till the tribunal, it's all done within the Vatican as such. So the jurisdiction remains with the Vatican. But it's about building a system, and as you can imagine, you start somewhere. So you have to bring the reporting entities, so for example the IOR or whatever, to get training. No? So you work closely together. You want to build the system together. You want to have a sustainable system that then really also works. So you have the reports that are coming in to the FIU, to the promoter, so you have the whole chain. And in a very short period of time, I think a lot of progress has been done. In 2012, there was one single so-called suspicious activity report. Now, we just published 3 days ago the latest annual report, so you have all the statistics in here in full transparency. We have, in the last 4 years, we had more than 1,000 suspicious activity report. So, a minimal increase. But it doesn't mean that there is more illicit financial activity here in the Vatican. Not at all. But it means that the system is working, started to work, so that you have a proper monitoring systems in place, that the financial institutions do know who their clients are, how the business is carried out, the profiling, etc. So also when you have seen in the media, kind of in the last years, that more than 5,000 clients have been exited in a way or another. It doesn't mean that there were whatever kind of 5,000 criminals within the IOR as such. There were many dormant accounts. No? Then, let's say, the narrative and who is allowed to be a client to the IOR has changed massively. No? I think but that's my very personal view, rightly going back to the roots. So to get again, really what does the Institute stand for? It mainly stands for to provide services to bring ahead religious works. So you kind of narrowed that down. So there, a lot of progress has been made. International environment, I mentioned it. So we started to sign, I think in the meanwhile, more than 35 or more so-called memorandum of understandings, which allows us to work together with other authorities. Absolutely key and crucial. But then also you have to fill it with life. We became member to the so-called Egmont Group, which is the global or the global umbrella organization for so-called financial intelligence units, which also facilitate and fosters international cooperation. So that angle, pretty positive. You see in the media today, there are certain words that, that there's a lack of prosecutions, lack of indictments here in the Vatican. Again, it's a process, so it's really building a system, and the chain here, so the last kind of part of this chain are the indictments, are the prosecutions, and then at some point, potentially, if necessary, convictions. So, but I think also there, big progress has been made. Let me move to the second pillar on the supervisory side. So, and that was something completely new in building in the so-called prudential supervisory system as such, in looking into the governance, in looking into internal procedures, fit and proper checks of the people that are working there, having job profiles, having clear processes in place that allow kind of this kind of processes or this kind of developments I was just mentioning, especially also on the reporting side. Also here, so we're going back to the first law, which has covered that in 2013, and then to the regulation number 1, which came in January 2015. It's very young, so, and we have to do that together. So it's not kind of a naming and shaming exercise, it's a work together in building a system together, authority with financial institution. I'm convinced dialogue is much better as confrontation. If it's necessary, we have the measures, we can sanctions, we can do that, but again, we're sitting in the same boat. We all want to have kind of an integral financial sector here in the Vatican as such. Now, what are the challenges in front of us? And then I will close in opening up for questions. I think the challenges here is really a lot has been done in a very short period of time. I've spoken about the legal framework, I've spoken about the institutional framework. Big process. There has been a lot of media attention in the last, I would say, 12, 18 months, much less in that field. Honestly, gratefully, because we want to do our job in the most accurate way, but also in the most boring way. So we do it for the Vatican, to protect the institution, and for nobody else. So I think kind of the challenges here are really to continue with the implementation. To set up something is sometimes, I would say not too difficult, because you're driven by the setup, you're driven by the vision, but then keep it and continuously kind of to further elaborate the system in place. I think that is something where we can't stay still. So I think we have started this path. We have to continue to go this path with all consequences, because only that allows us to do our work. And there is a different element here which you don't have to forget. So if you have, like Switzerland, I'm a Swiss citizen, so if you talk to the banks there, their kind of biggest interest is that they look good towards their regulator. They don't want to have problems with their regulator. In Italy, probably similar, with Banca d'Italia and all that. So I think here it's different. I think we do have a different moral obligation in doing this work. So it's I'm representing the regulator, but my responsibility ultimately, apart from the Holy Father, it's towards 1.2 billion Catholics out there, believers. No? So it's a different moral obligation you have, and you want to build a system that is sustainable, that is functional, and that serves and protects the Church. Thank you.